Good evening. This is Worship Lit, Class 3, and this is March 31st of 2020. A few announcements. I will try to post a class by Tuesday evening after I record it. I'm recording in real time on Tuesday evening, and but my understanding is that now there isn't. There are some issues with receiving the class live streamed when I'm streaming from my home. So I'm not sure when that'll be resolved. But anyway, I should have the class posted by Tuesday evening, if not sooner. So just be aware of that. Assignments, I'm doing this for all my classes. I'm extending assignment due dates each week. Instead of having them due on Sunday evening, I'm going to have them due on Monday by midnight. That's the day before class of each week. I am instituting a penalty for being late. So after Monday at midnight each week, those particular classes, for each day you're overdue, I'll knock 10% off. So 10% off for each day. So get it in on time. You don't have to worry about it. So there's no final for this class, and there's no you don't have to hand in a course notebook. We will continue with the weekly writing assignments and the song reviews each week. Then you will have to or need to do a service order project, and then of course the outlining of the Siegley books. So, all right, let's get into this. This is our third class together, and the assignments due, actually the assignments that are overdue at this point, if you haven't turned them in, you should have the ones that were due on the 29th were outlining chapters 4 and 5 of the Siegley book. You should have turned in a traditional hymn-based worship service. You should have answered, written a 300-word essay, 300-plus word essay on what must you know to be saved. And then there were 5 songs to review for this week. That's the CCLI public domain under popularity. You were going to pick 5 out of the first 10. Those would be traditional hymns. And so those, the 5 songs, your reviews of those 5 songs should be posted too. You can, you can post them directly to Canvas. You could certainly send them to my email address, tom.stolberg@calvary.edu, if that works better for you. All right. For this week, we are going to talk, you should have read the chapters on contemporary music-driven worship. Make sure that you do that if you haven't already. For next week, to read for next week's lecture, Spectrum, out of the Spectrum book, Charismatic Worship. And this week, you were outlining the Siegley Bradley books, chapter 4 through 5. So next week, you would be outlining the chapter 6 through 9. So be aware of that. I think I have some wrong numbers on here. All right. So your reading outline for next week should be chapter 6 through 9 of the Siegley. Your worship order due next week, and again, this will be Monday at midnight. That's April 6th, Monday at midnight. The contemporary music-driven worship. So we're going to talk about contemporary music today, and you're going to do a contemporary music-driven worship service for next week, and I hope you incorporate some of the things we've talked about. Essay number 3. This is your essay for next week. Do you envision the use of traditional hymns in your future as a worship leader? If yes, in what way will you be using them? And if not, why? And that's 300 words, and that'll give you some time to actually think through and flesh out your position on traditional hymns and how you see them being used in services you're doing in the future. Song reviews number 3 for next week. I'd like you to go to CCLI. Again, you're going to go over to the left-hand side, and there'll be some choices there. You're going to pick the choice that says Top 100. That's the top 100 songs being used in America right now in churches that subscribe to CCLI, and almost every church does. And so you can look at this and say, okay, well, these are the songs that are happening in church right now. Can't get much more contemporary than knowing what's happening in the church overall throughout the country. I'd like you to review the first 6 songs, the first 6 songs. Don't pick 6 out of 10, but do the actual first 6 songs, and use the same system that we've been using up to this point. Look at all the different aspects of the song, of each song, and comment on it. So that's your review for next week. And of course, it should be available on Canvas right now. All that should be opened up and available for you to read through. All right. Okay. Brief little walk through history here, as we and we'll, if time permits, we'll try to spend a little more time talking about music history in terms of worship history as we go through different styles of worship. And if we were all together as a class and you could respond, I would ask you, how old is the earth? And if you are a young earther and I'm a young earther, you'd say somewhere around 6,000 years old. I'd ask you, how old is mankind? And the answer to that is consistent with the first answer, probably 6,000 years old. If we take the biblical account, Earth is 6,000, around 6,000, and mankind is around 6,000 years old. The history of mankind. How old is music? Well, that's interesting. We don't know exactly how old it is, but we do know when it's first mentioned. We can go to Genesis, and Genesis chapter 4, let's look at verse 20. And it says, Ada gave birth to Jabal, and he was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. So it's a first mention of farming. As a matter of fact, we have the first 3 occupations of all time listed here. The first is farming, and the last is metalworking. That's Tubal Cain, the forger of implements of bronze and iron. That's verse 22. But here's verse 21, the first time we see music mentioned, and also one of the first 3 occupations mentioned in the Bible, and that is Jabal has a brother, and his name is Jubal. Verse 21. His brother's name was Jubal, and he was a father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. So we have lyres and pipes there, and that's Genesis 4. So we can pretty much figure that music is about 6,000 years old, or pretty close to 6,000 years old. So it's been around for as long as man and the earth has been around. So there's a nice long history for music, but we really don't see it being written down. I don't know what the music sounds like from 6,000 or 5,000 years ago. I can tell you that we have an inkling, but not very well, of music from even a couple thousand years ago. But the first music was written down around 2000 BC. So 2000 BC, from the area that we'd now call Iraq, music was being written, but musicologists are not in agreement exactly what it would have sounded like. So there was a different scale being used at the time, different tunings. We know that because we've recovered instruments from grave sites, and they're tuned differently, a different system than how we tune now. But we do know that it was attempted to write the music down in 2000 BC. Then in Greece, from 4th to 6th century BC, music started to become more organized, and we have manuscripts of music being recorded, but we don't have again a perfect understanding of what the music actually sounded like. But we do start to get an understanding of the music theory of the time. So that's Greece, early Greece. In 850, we're going to jump forward. 850 AD in Europe, notation um, uh, comes into being, and it's a notation that we do understand. At 850 AD, there's something called numes that are being used that look a lot like our current notes, but they're actually, the note heads are square. There aren't as many lines and spaces on the staff. Um, and uh, there is rhythms aren't being recorded to an extent, but we do have the beginnings of what we would call music notation. And that arrives, it comes about because of the church. The church starts to write. There's always been popular music. That's Popular music is a part of the of of cultures around the world and has been throughout history. The church, though, takes music and starts to apply it to worship, and that starts all the way back with Jewish worship. We may talk about that on another class, but I'm going to do a quick 10 or 15-minute survey of music history just so we're on the same page. But by 850 AD, there is an attempt to codify music in a way that it can be reproduced and then distributed. And that comes about because Charlemagne is trying to unify Europe around a single idea, but there are so many different languages there. Charlemagne figures that one of the ways he can unify the European uh, continent is by unifying the liturgy, the church liturgy, and he does that through one of the ways he does that is through music. So certainly liturgy, language, music all come around in the form of a Latin worship service, and so we get this an extension um, from the time of Christ moving forward after about 300 years after the Christ walked on earth. Um, we get we get a form of worship that arises and actually solidifies around this chant that about 500, 600 AD, so much so that by the time we get to 850 AD, things are quite unified. And so there are, you can go across the European continent and have fairly stable worship services from one country to the next. By the 16th century, by the 1500s, we settle on a 5-line staff, 5 lines and 4 spaces. And we just an overarching idea that I want you to think about as you think about music history is the idea of God to monarchs to men. And what happens is that there is, though popular music is part of society, all societies from the beginning of those societies. In actual worship music, um, that has where there's actually a sense of crafting that music and preserving that music. There wasn't a reason to write down music and preserve it until it started to be written down for the church, so that people that were writing for the church felt that this was important music and they wanted to keep it for future generations. So that's what drove the first music notation. And so if you think of music history in the Western tradition, um, think of it in terms of God to monarchs to men. So the music at first is driven, music that was actually being produced and written down was being driven by the church for the purpose of the worship of God. As the Really what happened was one of the things that happened was we had the plague, and when the plague hit, distrust of the church caused monarchs to be able to rise. There were other things that involved with that too, but um, probably a reasonable time to talk about plagues right now. And so the plague in the medieval period um, that wiped out so many people, a quarter of Europe, um, also gives rise to distrust of the church, and there is a desire to shift control focus from God and the church over to monarchs. And so we actually see this kind of shift from God to monarchs. And then as monarchs take over, and the monarchs are um, also part of the um, uh, we did have monarchs during some of that plague-ridden period in the Middle Ages, um, uh, and we go through a Renaissance period, where there's a rise of humanism, and by the time we get to America, same time that America is going through um, uh, the War of Independence, uh, the the War of Independence, which is going on all over the place. The French are overthrowing their king. America's overthrowing its king, and we have these different societies that are uh, taking replacing their kings with elected officials. So again, God to monarchs to men. And if you think of it in terms of when the church is in power, um, the virtually all the music that's being written down is for the church. And when monarchs rise to power, uh, the music, as the rise of monarchs occur, the the church and the monarchs share this kind of uh, robust compositions that are going on, and they're being written for both the church and for the monarchy. So, because that's where the money is in those two entities. Ultimately, the monarchs rise to greater power. They're overthrown, and uh, it goes from monarchs, ultimately music from monarchs, um, to mankind, where you end up with Beethoven, and Beethoven is writing music for the common man and for posterity, and kind of the ultimate humanistic view of mankind, and ends up with the Ninth Symphony, which is the fourth movement of the Ninth Symphony, which is a choral movement, and it's basically a manifesto to humanism. So I like to think of music history in the Western world, in that sense of God to monarchs to men. And so as Charlemagne comes to power, the church is still all powerful, but it's right at this point where 800 A.D. going into the 11th and 12th centuries, where there is where the root of humanism, Notre Dame Cathedral, where for the first time up to this point, uh, church compositions are written by anonymous, and by the time we get to 1150, 1200 A.D., we have two gentlemen, Lannon and Periton, who are monks working at the Notre Dame Cathedral, signing their works. And it's the rise of polyphony and the rise of chords come out of this time. And it's not just them, but they're working in Notre Dame. Notre Dame is finished about 1163 A.D. Beautiful church in Paris, and it burned recently. And but we know who the architect is for Notre Dame Cathedral. It was an amazing, actually, architectural invention. Gave us flying buttresses and the first multi-storied, beyond two stories structure. And of course, it was built for the church. That's where the money was, and the church could afford it. So, but from there we keep going. By 1517, we get 95 theses hammered onto the Wittenberg church door by Luther, and those 95 theses describe the abuses of the church, and the Reformation takes hold there, and shortly after that we have the Council of Trent from 1545 to about 1563, and there's a mad dash to see who can become more seeker oriented in worship. So what happens is that the worship services at that point, which are all done in Latin, now become uh, services that are being done in the vernacular, vernacular being the language of the people. And I think we talked about this a little bit very first day of class. Um, maybe not, but this is a good time to bring it up. So uh, both the Council of Trent and the Lutheran Reformation and the Reformation that's going on in other parts of Christianity are leading people to get away from the high church um, liturgy to a more common man liturgy, still liturgy driven. But the hymns at this point become, instead of being Latin chants, chants, Gregorian chants or plain chants out of the Middle Ages. By the time we get to the middle 1500s or so, the hymns are now in the common language of the people that are worshiping. So if you're German, you're singing a German hymn. That all starts here at this time frame, and it starts because of Luther. And these hymns, some of which are translated, which are Latin hymns translated into the language, let's say into German or French at the time. German, let's say they're being translated into German. In addition to that, there were some popular songs that were being used and reset with Christian lyrics, not too different than how we write songs today. And those came into the church, and so this was the beginning of what we could call um, uh, traditional hymnody. And as a matter of fact, A Mighty Fortress is Our God is from this time. So not with the same rhythms. The Mighty Fortress is Our God is much more syncopated if you look at the original manuscripts than what we sing today in the church. But so there's a number of things that arise from this time, and that would be something that's carried over from this time period. 1600, by the time we get to 1600, there's a big shift in, we start to enter this age of enlightenment. And 1600 is kind of the precursor to that. And we get the rise of opera. Opera, which is totally a secular form of entertainment, and definitely clearly a reflection of the humanistic thinking that's going on at the time. So after opera, and at the time, church music was very robust too. We get into the 1650s, 1700s. By 1700, Bach is composing full tilt, and so we have this very robust kind of Baroque music being used in worship services. Lutheran services are 4 hours long. Everything's in German. People can sing along. There's a massive cantata in the middle of a service. So in the 4 hours, maybe an hour of that is a cantata that Bach would have written the previous couple weeks specifically for that service. Very dynamic time for music, and a very high, and the music that's being produced is at a very high level. Uh, Trained musicians, paid musicians, um, people were, the services became, in many ways, became the social event of the week because there wasn't really anything else like it going on. So the services uh, were great at attracting people too. I guess again, secret type services, um, but also there was a very real sense of devotion to God, and the buildings that were being built were major cathedral edifices that were high soaring walls and opulent ceilings. And it was, in a sense, people were building the very best for God. They were composing the very best for God. And at the same time, there's a rise of the aristocracy that we've talked about, God to monarchs to men. And and these things are existing, coexisting. By the early 1700s, 17 maybe 36, 37, I believe, we get the invention of an instrument called the soft loud. It's called the soft loud in Italy, but the Italian word for soft, piano, and the Italian word for loud is forte. And so the guy who invents it, Christopher Fiore, who invents this instrument called the soft loud in our language, but pianoforte in his language, sticks. And that is our modern piano. Now, then, this piano was a square instrument, and it doesn't look exactly the same now, but it is the same functioning instrument that was invented in the early 1700s. And that piano becomes the basis for all sorts of things in composing and becomes a very important instrument and starts to supplant the organ, which had been around from about 850 AD, back when Charlemagne is out there proselytizing Europe. So and then 1800 to the present has been from 1800, which would be Beethoven, um, uh, Schubert, Haydn, those composers, Mozart, 1800, he died a little bit before that, but around 1800 to the present, we've had a very homogeneous uh, uh, body of music that's been written. We talk about hymns and we talk about contemporary music, but the truth is that if you look back over the last 2,000 years, hymns and contemporary songs are much more alike than they are different compared to other stuff that has come over the last 2,000 years. So we can look at from about 1800 to the present as being a very homogeneous. Music is very similar. It's based on major and minor scales and rhythms and uh, uh, treble and bass clef, um, 5 lines, 4 spaces, uh, 4/4 and 3/4 meter is very common. 2/4 meters, 6/8 in terms of meters. Um, Musical notation has not changed. Tempo markings haven't changed. I mean, it's very homogeneous. So if you're a trained musician today and you pick up music from 1800, you can look at it and you understand it. You may not like it, but or you may think this is really old stuff. But the truth is that the harmonic language, the construction of that music, the method of reproducing that music and understanding that music, the written music, really hasn't changed for the last couple 200 years. So, a couple things to mention. Fanny Crosby, 1820 to 1915, wrote over 8,000 hymns. She wrote some secular music. The vast majority of the stuff that we sing in the church, whether contemporary or traditional, has been written in the last 200 years. Some is older, like Mighty Fortress is Our God, or Let All Mortal Flesh Be Silent, that we talked about last week. Um, and so this idea that there's some great old hymns of the faith, again, doesn't hold true, because what would be a great old hymn of the faith? Something from 1500, something from 850 AD, something that the early church was singing at 200 AD or 150 AD that we aren't even sure what it sounds like, or something that was being sung in the middle of the 1800s. What is a great old hymn of the faith? It shows an ignorance of history and culture, um, uh, and I think it's important to understand that. But it's also important to know that we spent the last 300 years 200, 300 years sifting through the music that the church has used for worship. In a typical hymnal, like I said last week, a typical hymnal has some of the very best stuff that's been written in the last 300 years. Most of it from the last 200, but from the last 300, even 400, 500 years old. And so we owe it, I think, to God that as we move through um, our careers as musicians, as church musicians, that we strive to find the best or write the best or maintain the best um, songs for our congregations that we can. So we might talk a little more about history, but I wanted to give you just kind of a brief uh, overview. I guess that was kind of brief, 30 minutes. Now I want to talk about contemporary music-driven worship, and that's the topic of this week, and that's the things that you're going to be working on as you work through your assignments. So in this book, again, contemporary worship. Um, the fellow that wrote this article is Joe Hornis, who was active, may still be active at Willow Creek. I've been to Willow Creek. Maybe you've been to Willow Creek. It's a huge church, and is in many ways, it's kind of a grandparent to what we think of when we think of contemporary Christian music today. Um, and I want to start as we talk about contemporary music-driven worship. I want to start our conversation about just trying to define contemporary and how hard it really is. What is contemporary music? Now, at its face value, you would say, well, contemporary music is anything that's being used in contemporary churches today. But the truth is that as a worship leader, I have a service that is contemporary with some blended elements in it, and as most churches, it's most churches, I think it's really hard to put a label on it and say that they're exactly this or exactly that worship style. Most churches have a smattering of different styles within the context of a typical worship service. Certainly, the church I pastor at is that way. And so, if I talk about contemporary worship in the context of who I am, I would have to go back 40 years when I was leading worship in a young Bible church, and the music was uneven. And I remember even at the time, I was a master's candidate at a school working on a master's in music, and my wife and I were attending this church, and I remember thinking, "Ooh, some of this music's really awful," and it hasn't survived, and it's a good thing that it hasn't, because it was. Um, I think I mentioned to you we were singing "Amazing Grace" to the tune for "House of the Rising Sun" by the Animals, which is, look back on it, seems like a travesty now, but there were also some songs that were actually um, really lovely pieces of music. They sound rather dated now. And then there were the Bill Gaither things that have not weathered well. Um, but that was contemporary, and some of that stuff was really cutting edge at the time we were doing it. Even while I was leading worship, Integrity Music came on the scene, and Integrity Music was kind of the forerunner. It was before Hillsong, certainly before Bethel. So if we think of the latest, Hillsong's been around for quite a while now. So if we think about Hillsong 20 years ago, Integrity Music rose maybe 40 years before that, or 35 years before that, and Integrity Music was driving contemporary worship in the United States. It was one of, if not the main source for contemporary music. And I can look back on it, and they're gone now. Integrity Music basically doesn't exist in the form that it was when I was leading worship at that time. But the same thing will happen with Hillsong. The same thing will happen with Bethel Music. The same thing will happen with Sovereign Grace. These are all um, institutions, or they're all businesses, music businesses, and ministries that are at kind of the height of their popularity. And what happens is that all contemporary things become not contemporary. If you hold on to it long enough, it's no longer contemporary. So the thing about a timeless hymn, in Christ alone, would be a timeless hymn. And even though it's not an old hymn, it will be timeless because it does not sound contemporary, even from the beginning of its existence. It was written in a style that could be called a traditional hymnatic style, hymnody. So, what is contemporary? I can tell you that I think most of you, and we've talked a little about this already, but I think most of you are probably in your 20s, early 20s. When you're 45 and 50 and leading in a church, you're going to find that there are 20-year-olds that are coming in, and they're going to find your music is old-fashioned. And so your choice as a worship leader is to say, you can be like um, some of the old people in the church I pastor at that say, "Oh, these old hymns are better than anything that we have today," and they'll argue that we should go back and do old hymns. And then you'll have some old people saying, "Hey, music changes, culture changes, the Word of God doesn't, and what we want to do is adopt a musical language in our worship services that fit the people that are worshiping." So I'll just give you a heads up. So what you would call contemporary and what I would call contemporary, actually what I would call contemporary is what you call contemporary. Um, but I only do that because I happen to be a musician and I understand that contemporary music changes over time. Um, so as we talk through this, remember that Joe Hornish is writing from a contemporary viewpoint that is uh, Willow Creek. And Willow Creek is still fresh. They still use fresh music, and they're still on the contemporary side of things. But it, but understand that the music that Joe Hornish would have been doing 30 years ago, or 35 years ago, is not the same music that Willow Creek would be doing today, because they have gone through the process of updating their music, because they are seeker sensitive, and they are looking for a hook to bring people into their services and present the message of Christ and His salvation through popular culture. So um, we'll talk about Joe here. His main points in this chapter is emphasizing the examining of the heart of worship from an Old Testament perspective. And so he says, and this is important, and I really like this chapter, actually. It's a great chapter, and it's a great chapter even if you don't bring up uh, the issue of contemporary music. Um, so if we look at Numbers 14:11, and make sure I have the right one. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will this people spurn me, and how long will they not believe in me, despite all the signs which I have performed in their midst? I will smite them with pestilence and dispossess them, and I will make you into a nation greater and mightier than they." Okay, so there's Numbers. And then Isaiah 29:13 says, "Because this people draw near with their words and honor me with their lip service, but they remove their hearts far from me, and their reverence for me consists of tradition learned by rote." And again, this is God saying that His people are just paying lip service to Him. I'm not interested in having God say that I pay lip service to Him. I mean, I shudder at the thought that God would think that of me. God desires my worship. God desires the worship of His people. God wants a relationship with us. That's kind of the core of what Joe Harness says contemporary music-driven worship is. It's this sense that um, on the negative side, it's a response to it's a response to the verses that say people say they love God, but they don't show it. The worship has become mundane, and this is in contemporary worship rises out of the sense that traditional stuff, um, that traditional worship has become mundane. It's become routine. When God talks about you're just worshiping me, it's just rote. You're just going through the motions. You're just paying me lip service. Um, and and Joe Harness says this is at the core of what um, Willow Creek was going through. Willow Creek came about in the mid to late 70s, I guess it was. And by 1983 or so, Bill Hybels, who was the lead pastor of that group, goes to a charismatic church, and he watches a charismatic service and sees the kind of heartfelt, emotionally driven worship that Bill Hybels says is he writes that it was a very moving and very real and very authentic, and said that is what we need to have at Willow Creek. And so, though Willow Creek is not charismatic, it's Baptistic in doctrine. Bill Hybels goes into the charismatic church and borrows the approach to music without the charismatic stuff and brings it into Willow Creek. And uh, what he wants to avoid is something John Piper said: "Where feelings for God are dead, worship is dead." And what Hybels wants to avoid is the sense that the feelings for God are dead and that the worship is dead. Um, he Hornis, it's a great chapter. Hornis talks about sharing. He takes two musical demonstrations. He takes a kind of traditional and contemporary services and or a traditional hymn and a contemporary song, and does them both lackluster, without any meaning, without any um, real sense of devotion and focus on God, and says, "Look, it doesn't matter. A traditional hymn that's lifeless is dead, and a contemporary song that's lifeless is also dead, and it's worthless in terms of worship." And his point is the danger of worship falling into something that's routine, whether it's traditional or contemporary or liturgical or charismatic. And it's interesting uh, that the folks that then write the follow-up chapters for this all praise Joe Harness on his heart and his desire for worship and his desire to see God truly praised and truly worshipped in a service, regardless of the style of music. So again, if there were one chapter that you'd really want to focus on, it would be this one, because I think the heart of worship is really uh, is is really clarified in this chapter by Joe Harness, and you can see again others responding to it in a very positive way. So contemporary music is born out of this sense of uh, trying to move worship that had become casual and mundane into an authentic interaction with God. It's not that all traditional services or all hymn based services or all liturgical services had become casual and mundane. It's just the sense that many of them had, and that the life had kind of drained out of most churches. And Willow Creek was at the forefront of trying to lift churches out of that. And the way that they decided to do that was by changing up the music um, uh, to allow the music to reflect parts that were more engaged in true, authentic, thoughtful worship. So, understanding contemporary worship. Um, in this case, uh, contemporary worship becomes a kind of a fresh look at worship from a practical standpoint. Modern instruments, modern styles, modern arrangements, um, very much reflecting what pop music of the time is and style is. It's actually the same thing that was going on when Luther was doing his services, um, and Bach was writing music for the Lutheran Church services. So even in the 1500s and 1600s, into the 1700s, there was a sense of trying to capture uh, the essence of what the popular music of the masses, uh, the, the music that was being produced by the masses, would have resonated through the church. Now, there are some definite exceptions to that, but the hymns would have been more in the pop style of music during those services, and then the trained musicians would have uh, music that was written at a much higher standard. So it uh, popular music and style is at the core of this style of worship. It's not a jettisoning of old values. Um, it's the purpose. When you understand that contemporary worship didn't about because there was a sense of trying to destroy old values or to purposely get rid of old music styles or old genres. It was a desire to connect people in their language. It's the same thing that was happening at the Reformation, to connect people in their language in the worship of God. And when I say in the language, not just vernacular, not just spoken word, but the cultural language of their music. And so contemporary music said, look, churches are writing church music is in this style that no other institution is using this music. Now, if you go back and look at the traditional guys and the liturgical guys, they'll say, well, that's because we don't want our church music to sound like the world's music. Okay, and that is a choice. But contemporary music actually embraces the world's what would be called the world's music and co-ops it for God. And again, it's not the first time this has happened. It's happened in the church before, and it's one of the main drivers of the Reformation. So let's see. I want to move through some of this. Um, if you are a church that decides to become contemporary, and you don't have a vision in doing that, and you don't have an understanding of doing that, one of the responders to this chapter actually says that she has helped churches transition from more traditional worship to more contemporary worship, and she's questioned the motives of some of those churches. If you don't have a vision for the reason that you're transitioning to a contemporary music, or that you're adopting a contemporary music style of worship, um, then it is going to appear to be an assault on the church. It's just we're being different just for the sake of being different. Um, but it, even though it is a modernization of music in the church, you want it to be more than that. If you're in a position where you're leading worship and you're doing contemporary worship, um, you want that contemporary worship. You want to take advantage of it and how it allows people to worship in a musical language that they understand, in the music that they listen to every day. Um, let's see, we've already talked. We've talked about kind of he does say that the great hymns offered great teachings about God, but teachings without feelings. I don't really agree with that. I think some of the great hymns, some of the older hymns, the great hymns of the faith, some of these older hymns um, actually have a for me, deeply connect me to the work of Christ on the cross and the person of God and deep theology that some of these old songs can, cause me to weep. Um, but by the same token, that happens with contemporary worship songs too. That again um, focus on um, my relationship with God and what He's done for me. Um, again, can move me to tears. Contemporary worship, Harness says that contemporary worship strives to escape worship spectators. And so he says the main goal is relationship. In a contemporary worship service, the main goal is a two-way communications, God to us and us to God in this exchange. And he says that it escapes from organ music that didn't communicate with the younger generation, hymn lyrics that don't speak of emotion, and churches that don't speak the language of their people. And he says contemporary worship is seeker sensitive. And again, what he's saying by that is that if you bring a friend to church and that person's never stepped into a church before and they sit down in a traditional or a liturgical service, everything is foreign to them. And you're demanding that they have to learn that language before they can understand what you're talking about in terms of who God is and what He's done for them. But a contemporary worship service is or should be or tends to be seeker sensitive. So the use of the arts and the modern style of the music attracts people from the outside of the church in a way that they can identify with some of the very things that are being produced, whether that's through a play or through visual artistic representations or through the music. They're not the sounds are not foreign to them. They're listening to guitars and drums and singers outside of church, secular, and now they're coming in and hearing the same type of music, only with um, uh, different types of lyrics. Um, and of course, with Willow Creek, um, Sundays, and I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but when I visited Willow Creek, Sundays were specifically for people who weren't Christians, and Wednesdays and Thursdays at that point were the nights when they had the worship and teaching for people who were Christians. So the Wednesday, Thursday services were for solid believers, and Sunday mornings were for people who were looking to check out the gospel. Um, there is he does mention that um, seeker services can be perceived as shallow. Um, and that's very true. Bill Hybels, in the last few years, has talked about how uh, they witnessed all of these professions of faith in Willow Creek, but these new believers never really took solid root. And he laments the fact that they had missed the opportunity to take all of these new Christians and really turn them into solid, deep-rooted believers. And so, though I think he believes that the conversions were real for the most part. I think he takes issue with the fact that he didn't develop. There's still a bunch of baby Christians, and that he didn't develop mature Christians. He just got a lot of professions of faith, and he laments that. And they've in the last 5, 6, 8 years since he's addressed it, they've taken steps to change the way the process of seeing people saved and then raised and discipled in the truth. Hornis goes on to say, worship is about meeting with God, not just observing Him. And then he talks about keeping our eyes on the goal. We desire to meet with God in any possible way, not just exclusive to the things that fit our style. And then talks about again, criticism. Talks about the criticisms concerning the style being consumer-driven and self-centered. Said it's all about me and my needs. And he said, yet worship is God's gift to man. God gives man the gift of worship. And worship should include personal experience. So a more traditional service person, somebody more oriented towards traditional would say, well, we have too many me's and I's in the music. And a contemporary person is going to say, yeah, that's exactly right. That's what we want. The roles of the contemporary worship leader, according to Hornis, we must focus on leading God's people and not a performance or rock concert, which is usually where many services gravitate. We have to think about the congregation and our choice of song, key, and meter so that they can participate. And one of the things that I talked about the other, last class period was that we need to pick songs that people can sing. And then our responsibility, we are an offering to God and an extremely important offering, our utmost for His highest. This requires sacrifice and planning. It requires flexibility in services that are finely crafted, and it requires artists and musicians to use their gifts to the fullest of their abilities. So, my response to Hornis is that I think he's right on in a number of ways. I love his understanding of worship and being authentic before God and not being afraid to express devotion and feelings towards God. But like all styles, it can become mundane, it can become rote. And if you decide to have a seeker style service for the sake of just growing your church, and there are plenty of churches that do that choose a style of music specifically to grow the church, and you're growing the church in numbers, but you're not being sensitive. You may be seeker sensitive, but you're not Christian sensitive. You can quickly end up with a church that is quite shallow, and when the tough times come, you're going to find that there's no real foundation in the lives of these people who are coming to your church. He also doesn't talk about the trauma that's caused in people who truly love the old hymns, people who worship with old hymns and do it with a real strong sense of devotion. Because the fact that you use hymns or traditional hymns out of a hymnal doesn't mean that you don't love God, and it doesn't mean that you can't worship with a true sense of devotion. You certainly can. And as churches have moved to more contemporary styles of worship, some of these a number of wonderful old people have been left in the dust, and some have left for other churches. Some have stuck it out and just said, well, I don't like the music, but I love the church, so I'm going to stay. But as worship pastors and worship leaders, we have such a responsibility to the people that we're leading. And we need to lead everyone. We need to take everyone with us. And more than anything, my challenge, the way I'm challenged at the church I pastor at, is trying to lead a diverse body with 15-year-olds and 17-year-olds and 85 and 90-year-olds in the same service. Some who love hymns, some who love contemporary music. And it's probably not that different than many churches out there, churches that you'll minister in. So we can't lose sight that our job is not to have a secret agenda to move everyone towards contemporary worship. Our job is to take people up the mountain to meet God. And we want to make choices that make it possible for people to do that. Also, I think he needs to be careful in suggesting that traditional churches don't have an emotional connection to God. When I lead worship at Word of Grace and I do a hymn, maybe that's from 1880 or 1910, and it's a hymn that the body embraces, people sing out and they love singing the hymn, and some people will cry, and there's clearly a connection to the hymn. So I would tell you, don't throw out hymns because you think that they're not cool or you don't think they're connecting with folks. And there's something special about watching an older person worship, having a younger person watch an older person worship, and see that they've connected with whatever song that they've done. So it's not about traditional versus contemporary music. It's about worshiping God. Yes, contemporary worship is extremely important and can speak to people in ways that most churches can't, but a good balance should be had between that of sensitivity to the unchurched and growth opportunities for the churched. All right, so the liturgical response, the guy that wrote the first chapter that we went over 2 weeks ago, he says, which is really cool, he says, Hornis's plea for contemporary worship is well written and done in exhortational style. A lot of scriptural references, and it's done in goodwill towards others. He says, contemporary music, though, is held hostage by the musicians. It is performance-based and often hard to control from becoming a rock concert. And contemporary music's emotions cross boundaries with sexual experience and innuendo. The lyrics are often open-ended and unclear as to their purpose and destination. That's the first response from the liturgical guy. I hope it doesn't cross. I hope the music in your churches is not crossing boundaries with sexual experience and innuendo. I know there are churches where that happens. I don't think it's any of the churches that you attend, but I don't think you'd have a hard time finding examples of that. And if you look, I think you can see it going on. But I think when you talk about contemporary music being performance-based and often hard to control from becoming a rock concert, I've seen a lot of liturgical stuff that's performance-based also, so I don't think that's a fair critique from the liturgical guy. But he appreciated Joe Hornis's heart. The traditional worship response says he wished he would have written his article about hymnody this way. He says the church has chosen, unfortunately, to be out of style and often behind in times. Contemporary worship is not the only answer to worship that moves hearts, and we should be sensitive to the leading of the Holy Spirit based on the congregation as we choose the correct worship genre. That's absolutely true. You need to look at the people you're leading and find a musical voice that works for everyone in your church. He does say, are we making a golden calf out of style? Are we turning style into an idol? And I would say yes. If you have if you're going to a church and you have people lining up on either side of the issue, someone's turning it into an idol somewhere, and it's something that you really need to address in the church. We serve a jealous God, and I would imagine that, and I don't want to speak for God, but I can't imagine that God is thrilled with us arguing over styles of worship. I think it's important to understand what they are, but you shouldn't want to be in the middle of controversy over the style of worship. We should celebrate our eclectic nature rather than be afraid of it or shy away from it. And the traditional worship guy says that contemporary worship has not borne anything significant in art. Of course, that's not true at all. There's been a lot of great stuff that's come out of contemporary music, contemporary worship. Gettys are, even though they're writing in a traditional style, are still the words are very contemporary in their hymns. And you will hear people complain about contemporary music being shallow or being poorly crafted. A lot of times it is. One of the things that you can do to help mitigate that is to pick the best music. Be extremely discerning about any music that you use in a worship service. There are tens of thousands of old hymns and tens of thousands of new hymns and tens of thousands of contemporary songs, praise songs, songs were written last week, songs were written 5 years ago. And when you're crafting a worship service, you might use 5 or 6 at the max of those songs. Why not pick the very best? Don't argue for a song that's questionable. Find a song that isn't. If you find yourself, in terms of programming music, if you find yourself saying, well, I really like that song, but it has this issue, or it's too high, or it's too difficult, or it's too complicated, or it's fine except for this one line, doesn't really fit us doctrinally, don't try to force it into a service. Choose not to do it and find something better suited for your service. Don't settle for second best. And certainly don't settle for something that's violating any of the important parameters you put down, that you have in place, that you use to pick songs for your worship services. Honor God and He will honor you. Charismatic worship response says that Horniss is speaking from personal experience with great wisdom and great weakness. He says Williams agrees with many of Horniss's statements, but makes an excellent point that Horniss argues from one perspective, his own experience. We must be careful to see that our own experiences can cloud our judgment and often fail to see other successful models. And that goes for all of us. We all, when I teach this class, I come from an experience that's different than when Jeremy Schelt teaches his class. And that's from a different experience than any one of you have. The fact that all 4 of you, I know that, let's see, I'm thinking through everybody in this class. All of you actually have led worship. And some of you lead from a more traditional style of worship, more hymn-based, and some of you are much more contemporary. And you don't want to be one of the people that are arrogant, that are going to say your style, that your choice is the best style out there, and that everybody else hasn't figured out the truths that you figured out. The truth is there's plenty of room for all of this music. You may go to a church that you can't get away with doing something too contemporary or too traditional, and yet you shouldn't be afraid of uh, of the landscape of worship material that's out there. If you were just a traditional worship person, I would urge you to look into some of the contemporary music, some of the best contemporary music. It's really wonderful. And if you are a contemporary person and you think the hymns are old and old fuddy-duddy, antiquated things, then I would tell you, go back and start. You don't have to. Don't even look at don't even listen to the music. Start by looking at the words. Go back and read through the poems of the words of some of these old hymns. And then once you get really familiar with the words and what they're actually saying, then go back and listen to the music. Um, some of these are really wonderful settings. Okay, blended worship response. Um, he says, the blended guy says, I believe Hornis offers an outstanding point when he says, who can love God with all their heart, mind, and soul? And of course, the answer is no one can love God with all their heart, mind, and soul, except for Jesus. And uh, as we call people to contemporary music or contemporary worship, let's not call them to something that's impossible or the expectation that certainly the goal needs to be to love God with all our heart, mind, and soul, but we fall short. And let's remember that the people we're leading in worship also will fall short, just as we do. Let's see. It is too much about what I ought to do and too little about what God has done for me. God has done for me what I cannot do for myself. He did it in Jesus Christ. That's on page 130 of the book. That comes from the blended guy. And finally, an emerging worship response. Changes in churches are often driven by wrong thinking, leading them to contemporary worship with the wrong attitude. She says smaller churches who are not ready for contemporary worship might be getting envious and making decisions to move towards that style before it's time for them. She says she loves the comment about hanging from the chandeliers and spitting watermelon seeds. Oh, no, that was a comment that she made. And she says, think about where people come from. Think about their backgrounds. Um, Baby boomers, I'm a baby boomer. Baby boomers, forever, we've been the largest part of the population. And in advertising and music and movies have all focused on baby boomers. And that's now starting to turn as baby boomers retire from the workforce and move out to their cabins in the woods. It's actually these next generations that are rising up, and you're at the beginning of that. And the voice of worship is shifting to a younger generation, even to the point where I would say that traditional contemporary worship has probably seen its peak, and we're now moving towards a different. We're now redefining what contemporary worship actually is, and so that's all I have for tonight. I want to remind you that let's see if I can find it. For due Monday night, remember you're going to read for next week charismatic worship sections. And here are the things due Monday night, April 6th, 2020. Your reading outline of Siegler Bradley, chapter 6 through 9. Your third worship service order, contemporary music driven worship. The essay, do you envision the use of traditional hymns in your future as a worship leader? If yes, in what way? If not, why? And then finally, song reviews. You're going to review the first 6 songs of the top 100 CCL Live songs. And you can do that through the license that you should have, that I sent you that first week of class that you should have access to. So again, as you go through um, the issues with quarantining yourself and the coronavirus, I pray that all of you would stay healthy and well, and that your families would weather it well. Um, I've got somebody was just remarking to me that I'm in a high risk category. I'm male. I'm over 60, and I have all these. And then somebody said, "Well, what's your blood type?" And I said, "Well, A positive." And they said, "Oh, that's yeah, 60% of people who die from it have A positive blood type." So I guess maybe I'm not long here for this earth. Even if the coronavirus doesn't kill me, I'm probably not long for this earth, and that's all right. So uh, the earth is not my home. I have better things to look forward to, but I do hope I'll be here uh, uh, a good long time before I finally go meet God face to face. But if you have some issues, things going on that you need to talk about, let me know and keep me posted. Otherwise, get your assignments in by next Monday midnight, and I will talk to you next week. God bless you.